So as you mentioned, we're going to be looking at Parlamento and early 19th century music. So I'm going to be sitting down this talk because I'm going to be playing a lot of examples, and getting up and down will just kind of be a little chaotic. So I'll just sit here and we'll kind of go through a bunch of these examples together. Okay, so the order of the talk, we're going to start with what is Parlamento, just quickly go over that. Then we'll follow that up with an overview of the rules, otherwise known as the regole. So I'll cover suspensions, rule of the octave, and bass motions. We'll quickly talk about guitar textures, and finally go over one of the few guitar pieces that I think is directly inspired by Parlamento, which is Giuliani's Fuguetto Opus 113. What you're seeing here, it's a little dark, but is a manuscript of a Parlamento by Leonardo Leo. So what you see is just the bass line moving up with figures. So now, not all Parlamento were just bass lines. They also introduced other voices. So in a fugue, each voice would be entered in with its own clef, and they weren't always figured. So they appeared in much different forms. So Sanguinetti is one of the premier Parlamento scholars. He writes that Parlamento is a sketch improvised on a single staff whose main purpose is to be a guide for the improvisation of composition at the keyboard. He contrasts it with basso continuo, writing Parlamento is a solo piece whose goal is teaching composition via improvisation, whereas the aim of basso continuo playing is accompaniment. So they don't always talk about the same things because the goal is learning to improvise or compose for a solo instrument, and chiefly improvise, whereas basso continuo is about accompaniment. But they, of course, have overlap. Robert Yergin is another Parlamento scholar. He characterizes the pedagogical approach as training students follow what he calls the thread. So he writes, Parlamenti were the musical threads given to apprentice musicians to guide them as they attempted to improvise music at the keyboard. By following these threads, the young apprentices would eventually learn to make their way in the world of adult music. So it's like a lead sheet, but it's instead of being a shorthand for an existing piece of music, it's something that the composer or improviser will make on the spot, using the bass line or the other material in the Parlamento as a guide. So what Parlamento do is they train schema and pattern recognition. The regole, they teach the basic axioms, cadences, suspensions, and other things, which are musical patterns. So there's Durante, Sala, Fenaroli. We're going to look at mostly at Durante and Fenaroli. But then counterpoint's also teaching schema, learning how to set the melody to different melodies of the same basses in multiple different ways. And there's many other schemas noted by Yergin, such as the Romanesca, Priner, Fonte, that appear all over Parlamenti. Yergin writes that schemata are essentially the gist of how a particular melody and bass go together to form a small phrase. So they're formulatic phrase constructions that depend on the context and the idioms of the musical language. So you have to learn the musical language and the idioms, and schema teach that. So because Parlamenti trained musical language, Parlamento's answer is something like, which intervals should I put over a given bass? Or you can't tell which chord to give a bass note unless you know where this note comes from and where it goes. So Parlamenti are intensely concerned with context and developing music language. Parlamenti teach these patterns and put them into context that students can practice in many different ways. So given that we have a bunch of sources in the 18th century and other Parlamento sources and compositions, why should we bother with the 19th century guitar repertoire? The answer is because the guitar has vastly different idiomatic considerations than the keyboard. Our instruments aren't built the same, so keyboard solutions can't always just be straight ahead adapted to the guitar. So the approach in playing Parlamento for guitar, we have to do it two different ways. We have to either look at relevant repertoire from the 17th century guitar, that could be for the Baroque guitar, such as Robert D. Bizet and others, or look at the six-string guitar in the early 19th century. Then the other approach is also to encourage modern guitarists to make new solutions on their own. So we're going to be looking at just the early 19th century. The composers from this period were masterful. They clearly understood these rules very well, and they knew how to adapt them really well to the guitar. Okay, so we're going to jump right into the rules. And we're going to start with cadences. So there's three primary cadence types in the Parlamento tradition. We're probably all familiar with the first one, so this is Cadence semplice. It's simple 5-3, 5-3 over 5 in the bass and then 1. We've all heard that before. And then the next one's cadenza composta. So that is we add a suspension. So if we look at, we can do it either as a 5-4, which is going to be 6/4. Last one's cadenza doppia. This is a 18th century cadence. It has 4 distinct movements. We start with a 5/3 chord, move to a 6/4 chord, then a 5/4, and then a 5/3. So it sounds like this. And what I want to point out with this is that the English translation of this is called a double cadence. And that comes from the 2 quasi-cantilens movements. So we hear. So in Italian solfege, that would be mi, fa, mi, fa. There it is. So that's the marker of a double cadence. So let's look at a guitar example. This one's from the Giuliani Opus 13, which we'll see later. Where I have the red arrow, that marks where the double cadence is. So we have 5/3. So we have that double cantilens. Let's see. So it occurs in 2 different registers. On the guitar, once we get tight textures like this, we often have to move it to another voice in order to give it some room. So if it's done smoothly, it works quite well. So I'll play the whole example and you can hear that. Another example from Soar. This one doesn't have the double cantilens, but has the clear 4 distinct movements of the intervals over the bass. So it continues this line from here. So we can hear 2 different examples, slightly different, but they still follow the double cadence. So next we'll move on to suspensions. I don't have time to go through every single one of these, so if anyone wants a copy of this lecture, feel free to ask me. I can email some sources. So the key takeaway for 4/3 suspensions, and then after we'll do 7/6 suspensions, is that they have the most available number of preparations. We can do consonances and also dissonances. So in this case, we have 2 different fourths. The first one's prepared by a diminished fifth, and the next one's prepared by a fourth. So the first one's characteristic, that diminished fifth, is characteristic of a discant clausula. So that's going to be 7/1/1. That motion. And then the second one, the 10th, is characteristic of the clausula tenazorum. That's 2/1/1. So the same bass, B, operates in 2 different clausulas and has 2 different characteristic preparations. So when we put it in context here. And so forth and moves on. So 7/6 suspension, same thing, very permissible with the number of preparations. We're going to look at this from Giuliani's sonata. This is part of a transition, move modulating to the dominant. So this is the very start of it. What you'll notice is that we have again the 2/1, A moving to G in the new key of G. So we start C, down a third, down a second. Whenever we see down a major second, it's often going to suggest that we're doing a clausula tenazorum. So 2/1, local new 2/1. So in this matter, we can actually, using that 7/6 suspension, the Partimeni offers with the 7/6, when you have this tenazorum, it gives a major 6. So if we incorporate that, we can modulate quite quickly. So let's, here we'll be in C major. See, we're already in G, and it's pretty smooth. I didn't do anything fancy, but quickly got into G. So when we put it in here and compare it with the 5th and resolve it to the major 6, you can hear how quickly it can change keys. Now confirm it. So now we're firmly in G major. Just quickly, that 2/1 move with the prepared 7th gets us there in a new modulation. Again, another type. This is prepared from the octave. This is 1 going to 2, going back to 1. Octave. So that's a quick, just little refrain. It's from Guado. Okay, now 9/8 suspensions. These have much fewer preparations. We only have 2 available ones. This is from the 3rd when we ascend by step. So for example, if we're moving from scale degree 4 to scale degree 5, we might get something like this. So this 3rd becomes the the fifth, when it ascends by fourth. So for example, if we're in A minor, we have a B over the E here. So let's do it like this. Here's the B. Okay, that. So this pairing reduce, we can also mix them with other intervals. So if you notice the stretch here, when we have the seconds between the third and the ninth, they can get really large in the guitar. So one of the things that often happens is lines move by continuous thirds, for example, and we can pair that with a suspended fourth to keep the thirds. It also makes it easier to play. So if we look at this example, we have the ascending by step. It doesn't break the melodic line versus here that doesn't really work very well. So we can pair it with the fourth. We do the same thing at the extending the dominant at the end of the cadence. This is prepared from the fifth. That's the ninth and the fourth prepared again. So I hope everybody's heard of this piece. This is Pachelbel's Canon. So we probably all know this one. Right? Every wedding. So this is a schema known as the Romanesque. So it's a gallant schema, and that goes back a long ways. So we're going to use this as a little example in texture, guitar textures, but also suspension chains. So here, one of the common ways to do it is we alternate between 4/3 and 9/8 suspension. So if we start with the beginning there, we have thirds. One voice moves down. We have seconds. One moves. So they kind of snake down. In that sort of a fashion. And because the bass moves down a fourth, up a step, down a fourth, up a step, you get different intervals even though the top line moves down uniformly. But what happens if you place it down here? So this is a comfortable spot on the guitar. We play down here all the time. But if you try this Romanesque schema, where it continues to move down, we start to get crunchy, and it doesn't work. It's even hard to figure on the guitar because it doesn't work at all. So we have to change things a little bit. One way is just to simply move it to a higher position. Just add up the upper voice up an octave, and we get much more separation. So it sounds like this. Maintains the seconds. The other one is to invert the seconds and the thirds into sixths and sevenths. So the bottom voice moves up just enough that we have enough room, and it's also, we don't have to, because we're not stretching across the neck vertically, we're going across the strings, the hand position works much nicer. So this is with the seventh and sixth. Close it the same way. As long as the dissonance resolves, the other voice can jump away. Come back to where we started. So let's look at one more suspension chain, and we'll use this as a lesson in levels of refinement. So what Partimenti did is they taught basic levels, basic models, and then they put them through a process of refinement where they added more and more detail. So we'll look at this in 3 levels. The first one is just looking at the consonants. So this is the outline. This is going to be printer descending in the bass, so 4, 3, 2, 1, with tenths, parallel tenths. So we get. That's just consonances. So now we can add a second layer of refinement. This is going to be adding the dissonances, the 4/3 suspensions. Added one other element to it. So now when we add the diminutions, which is what we'll be learning about in this lecture, a lot of different ways to do diminutions. This one's just a double neighbor. Moving around there. So when we add that to that pattern, we get this piece by Guano. suspension chain, 3 levels of refinement, simple to slightly more complex. So the ideal texture for guitar is 2 to 3 voices. We can do 4 voices when the texture is more static. Things like that. Or we can punctuate it with 4 voices every once in a while. So for example, if we have a dynamic texture with a moving accompaniment, 2 to 3 voices. So now we're 2. Right? Yeah, continue on. So I added 4 voices at the end there. Other than that, 3 to 2 voices. So that's for moving lines. So here's a disposition by Mattei. Dispositions are 3 or more voices set in different parts from a fully realized Cadence. He has this leapfrogging octave, moving to a 7th, 7/6, where each voice adds it on top of each other, so you get this jumping over effect. That doesn't work to just directly take and add it to the guitar. We have to do some changes. So the first option is to keep 3 voices and have the bottom move up in thirds, and then remove one of the 7/6s to maintain a clear line. So it sounds like this if you do it like that. Right, so that sounds like, I'm going to repeat again. So that sounds like that could come out of something like a Giuliani study. The other option is to maintain each one of those 7/6s, and we have to remove the thirds in the bass to free up another finger for up top. This would look like this. Both work. One maintains the counterpoint a little bit more, one creates a little bit more melodic clarity on the guitar, and it's easier to do. Now we're going to move on to rule of the octave. So what you see here is the essential elements of the scale. These are essentially the natural tones that belong on each step of the scale. These don't necessarily take any movement, but if you notice, it's scale degrees 1 and scale degree 5 are the ones with the 5ths. Everything else is 6ths, as we'll look at rule of the octave here. So we'll circle back to that for a second. But let's start with what often is taught in music theory courses. So this is something you might see in Untitled Chapter, for example. This is a bunch of 5/3 chords, or group position chords, that belong on each side of the scale. So it sounds like this, if you do it. So in this case, every 6 chords are inversions of the root position. Everything relates back to the 5/3 and it occurs on each set of the scale. However, in the 18th century, they didn't think like this. This isn't how they approached it. But instead, they approached it was with things like such as rule of the octave. So in this case, each one of those figures is a chord in its own right. So the 6th chord is a 6th chord in its own right. It's not a derivation of another chord. So in this, we see here, scale degree 1 and scale degree 5 are 5/3 chords. Everything else is some sort of 6. So that means scale degrees 1 and 5 are stable, 5/3 chords. Everything else is 6th chord, which are dynamic, moving between. So if we play that same C major scale with rule of the octave, it sounds like music. Right? And what it also does is it makes the tonality cohesive. The whole scale reinforces the tonality. And it values intervals over inversion. So we see 2 different patterns for ascent and another pattern for descent. So with descent, the first one has 6 chords. We can look at the figures there. So I'll just talk about the descent because it's a little different. We have a brief tonicization of 5. So we tonicize 5 for a brief second and move off. So scale degree 4 is different on the way up as well. This is the way back down. On the way down, we have 4/2. On the way up, we have 6/5 or 6. So I'll play it for guitar, and I'll play this musically, and I'll see if you guys. And so this is just going to be really octave going up and down, and you can hear it can really resemble music just by simply doing it. And this will be in G major. a few suspensions, but other than that, that was really octave going up, really octave coming back down. And then minor, I'll just do this one straight in minor. Now on the way down, we have a natural 7. So on the guitar, you can't just continually go up the scale like the keyboard has. We often have to do octave displacements. In C major, for example, this occurs it depends on the metric. So it depends where things are on the strong beat or weak beat. So these are approximate, but often it's between 3 and 4. So there we jump down. We were here before E. Now we're down to F below. And on the way down, here we're on the 6th string to G. We'll move to the 4th string for F. So this lets you stay in a single position. Otherwise, we'd have to move all the way up and down the guitar. Now, when we're writing music or improvising, yes, we have to know all the way up and down the closed positions as well. But generally, in accompaniment with melodic lines, we're going to get this sort of pattern over the closed positions more often than not. So let's look at some partimenti now. So this is going to be Fenaroli's book 1, number 1. This is his first partimenti. We're just going to play this really octave. It's going to be in 2 keys, the dominant and the tonic. And it's going to be just really octave the whole way through, and you'll hear it sounds like regular music. And you can figure an unfigured bass line easily with this. Octave, but those are tagged as well. Okay, so now we're going to look at Fenaroli book 1, number 3. So what you'll notice is that it has this keyboard diminution in the bass. So 1 and 5 are decorated with, it's a common pattern you see in music from this era. We can do it on guitar, but if we're going to create a florid melody, it's better to have a single and then add the diminution somewhere else, because the diminutions just prolong that tonic. Adds a little bit to the texture and prolongs it, so we can do that in other ways. So if we look at this study from Giuliani, we see the pattern is almost identical. So right here, we have the same as here, here, and here. So C, F sharp, C, D, E. It's changed a little bit, so if you look, same general outline. So I can take his melody as an example and apply it directly to the partimenti as just a lesson in how to adapt the music to the guitar. So we'll do it, we have it here, the boo-da-dee-da-dee-da-dee-da. And then the from down, we all see my cursor? Yeah. Down here. Over an extended tonic, and then we repeat it in E major, up an octave and then down an octave after the given cadence. So I'll just play the whole piece for you, and you can hear how the different parts from that study come in. that was really octave in a few different keys, just relying on little cues from the partimente to know which key I'm in. Now we'll do number 1, number 2. This is in minor. Visit a few different keys here. So in the original we have G, and then we move to C minor, and then to the relative major. G minor is hard on guitar. It's doable, but it's tricky. So we're going to do it in A minor instead. So what I want to point out here is revisiting the double cadence. So see how we have that G sharp A, G sharp A? That's again the double countersigns. So that's going to signal a double cadence. So we don't have to always do just scale degree 5 in the bass for the double cadence. We can extend it out with other notes to as long as they match up with the cadential pattern. So if I play this, you'll be able to hear it's clearly a cadence. Right? So if we look at this study from Soar, so this is Opus 31, number 20, we can take some cues from his writing to help with this partimente. So the first one we hear the opening here. So that's just the first few measures. We see it goes from scale degree 1 to 4 to sharp 4 to 5. So by going to 1, 4, sharp 4, 5, we can put that 5 squarely on the first beat of the measure. And we can maintain this melodic line. So if you look later in the same study, there's that same melodic line, except for this time we go 1, 2, 3, so now 4 is on the downbeat, which is extended through accented passing tone, and then compound cadence. So if we play it, now we have a cadence instead of landing on 5. We have sets it up for closure. So we can take that here and use that 1, 2, 3 model that he uses, and then close it with the double cadence instead. So I'll just play that a little bit. That closes the A minor section immediately. Now, when we look later, we see he moves to the relative major as well. Scale degree 1, really octave, 4, and compound cadence. And it shifts back to A minor. We can take that part as well and put it here. So it's a little different because we have some stepwise motion, but we just, again, can fill it in instead of jumping directly to 4. We can just step up through it through really octave. And we don't use compound here just because there's a different number of bass notes, so we're just going to do a simple cadence instead. Very simple. Now, let's look at 1, 7, 6. So this is descending minor. We have Soar. So in the really octave, they often give the sharp 6 instead. But you see in music, minor 6 also works fine. So we can do both are usable. We're going to use the sharp 6 in this model, though. You'll notice that Soar has it on that lower register, but we can bump it up to the higher register. So we can have both work because we're jumping to that C below it. It's better to start up high in this instance. So I'll just play that. That's just a few measures there. Okay? So I'll play the whole thing now so you can hear it all fits in context. It's mostly really octave with a few little neighbor notes here. I'm going to skip that one. So let's talk about how we can build a phrase structure using really octave as a guide. So we have a period construction phrase. The first in the antecedent, you see the ascending bass by stepwise motion with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Similar to before, stepping up stepwise, we're going to place 5 on the strong beat. So that sets up our half cadence. When we see it in the consequent, we don't move up stepwise, we instead jump immediately to 4 where we had 2 before. So that way we land on 5 early and set up a cadence and land on 1 to close it out for the perfect authentic cadence. So this is for the period phrase construction. So if I play it, you'll hear how they differ a little bit. Now the consequent. So we can add stepwise motion if we want to land earlier. We can skip directly to 4 if we want to land on 1 a little bit. Oops, sorry. We can stepwise if we want to land on 5 instead. We can jump straight to 4 if we want to land on 1 instead. Okay, now we're going to move on to bass motions. This is Durante's rules. These are 2 separate rules here. This is the rule for descending thirds. So Durante writes that when the note that starts this descent by third, you give a 5-3. So let's give it the 5-3 for it. So the middle one is a passing tone. Then you give a 6 to the lower one. So when you descend by third, doesn't matter, and you can use different diminutions. Right? The lower third is going to be a 6th chord. And what we'll notice is that the mi rule, that's when you ascend by half step or with chromatically sharpened notes, we always give the lower note a 6th as well. So it's think of it like a local 7-1, or same as real octave, scale 3, scale 3-4, it's a half step, scale 3-3 gets a 6. Yeah. So even if we're in C major, we add that sharp in the bass, it's a half step, gets a 6. Or a 6, you could also do a 6-5. So what happens when we combine them? We get the schema known as falling by thirds, rising by step. So this is a descending third, gets the 5-3. The lower third gets the 6. So when we put them together, we get this moving down by step, where in this case we get E, D, and C. And this is using Durante's diminutions as well. Now vary. Right? So that's just combining those 2 rules to make this new schema. So this is another example. This one's going to have a 6-5 chord instead. This is from Julie 9. So in this case, we're only doing 2 short modules, but we can actually extend this out. So this is a recomposition I did. So this is just continuing that on downwards. So in this case, I've added a D sharp down here to move to E minor, but I could have left that as a D natural and stayed in G major, or modulating just by adding a sharp later. So I'll play this one. And we'll move to E minor just by continuing the same down by third of the step. So 5-3, then 6-5, 5-3, 6-5, 5-3, 6-5. So when we descend by third, if we're in front of the tonic, we go just directly down a third. We start with the third and the fifth up top. So in this case, if we're in G, it would be B and D. So we get this sort of a pattern. So that's when you directly descend by third. But often these are part of a modulating schema. These cadences move such a modulating printer. These are part of. And this is when we're going to move to dominant. So that's when we descend by diminished fifth. So in that case, we want to start with the octave and the third. So let's look at this example. So this is a case of a modulating printer. So the start of it, we're in C major. But what we're going to do is put a C and E on the top. This is because we'll get this sort of a pattern here. So if we're in C major, then when we add the F sharp, we get a 6-5. But what do we notice here? It jumps to an A and then a G. It actually doesn't follow that closely. So what's going on here is ingano. So that's an Italian word. That was probably a bad Italian pronunciation, but it means deceit or trick. So what we're doing here is we're actually going to grab the other syllable from its associated hexachord, so from the hard hexachord. So in this case, we're in G major. So what we should expect is it goes from E, C and E, down to C and D. So in G, that would be, D would be do, re, mi, fa, sol, right? But from its hard hexachord, which is going to be D, if we play its sol, we'll see what note that is. So if I'll start in G, do, re, mi, fa, sol, now we'll move to the hard hexachord D, re, mi, fa, sol, we get A. So from its associated hexachord, D and A are both sol. So we can actually just swap them out. So when we hear that instead, we get this sort of effect. So we swap out sol there and then fa. So it sounds like this. Ingano. Right? So it's a way of melodic ornamentation. It's about creating some variety in there. And that's a simple way to do it from, in their perspective. It's because people in the 18th century would have known this. Maybe at least the people can train Partimento. So here's the Guidonian hand. What we see here, right here, so this is a mnemonic, I didn't pronounce it right, but for learning solfege. So we have gamma ut, re, mi, fa ut. And so here we have two different hexachords where they have the same note, same placement. And their syllables line up. So if you look at the next one, sol, re. So if you think about it in G, do, re, mi, fa, sol, D is sol. But then, like we said, from its associated hexachord, the D, sol is also, can be A in that hexachord. So in G, we have sol, D, sol, re, which is A. So they line up in the same spot. So you can see how they're related like that. And it moves up through many of the different hexachords. So let's look at, and we'll look at the recapitulation here. So this is when it moves back. This case doesn't have a nono. This one's just going to be, because it's compressed in the recapitulation, it just stays within the local hexachord here. So in that case, it's just so let's look at falling by fifths, rising by fourths. Many of you might know this as descending fifth sequence. In this case, we're going to have it set up as seventh suspensions. So with this, it's really, what you can do is just start with the 10th in the first voice. So if you start with the 10th, it sets up the first 7th. Then while that 7th plays, a 10th in the other voice is going to set up the 7th in that inner voice, and they go back and forth like this. So if I just play those two voices with the bass, so 3 voices, you can hear it. So there's the 10th up top. There's the 7th. Here's the 10th in the inner. Now 10th, 7th in the inner. So we get that alternating thirds in here. So I'll play just this example. So let's finish up with Figaro, Opus 13, 113. So this is by Mauro Giuliani, and I think it's quite closely based on Partimento. It uses many of the bass motions. There's only a little bit of root octave in here. It's mostly bass motions. So it starts with a bass motion called just tie bass. This is a tie that comes back to the note it began with. So in that, we give it a 4-2. What you'll notice is Robert Yergin calls these boring and interesting parts, which is kind of a funny way to phrase it, but so here we see what's a boring bass. It's just, right? And then an interesting part. So when you see this in a Partimento, often what it means is it's an invitation for imitative counterpoint. So what many times you can do is take the interesting part and put it on top of the boring part, and then vice versa, swap them. So they fit together kind of like a puzzle. So there's in Chimarosa's notebook from his time at the conservatories, he's got many of these where he writes it in. And you can see they taught this to him at an early age. So here you see this happens just like that. That bass here can fit over top of that melody and vice versa. G, 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 F, right? And then it continues on with another schema. But we see they fit together. So if I play them, this schema from tied bass. One other thing maybe before we move on is that this sort of phrase as an opening has a continuation built into itself. So we have a tied bass opening gambit to open it, followed by something that moves to 4, 5. So it has a continuation built into it, antecedent continuation. So following that, we have rising by step, falling by thirds. So this is just doing the rising by step before you do the falling by thirds. We have 7s added in. And then the same tied bass in G major. Now this is the Romanesca. So the falling by fourths, rising by step. And we have that 4-3-9-8 suspensions that we talked about earlier. So it sounds like this with his diminutions. Now we do fall by third, rise by step with 9-8 suspensions. Notice the 9-8 suspensions can get rather difficult to do. That's just because of the seconds, it's going to often end up that case. So you can practice them, or they kind of just remain difficult. So here's this right here. Now we'll look at the 3-6 or the monte. So the monte is when we rise chromatically from 3 up to 6, and we alternate 5, 3, and 6 chords. So scale 3 has a 6, 4, 5, 3. Now if you're just doing 5-6 motion, it would be something like this. I'll just do it in C. It moves up. This folds in that chromatic interval where the 6 would be, and we get this ascending chromatic one. So I'll play it just an example. Here we see it stops at 6, we move to the 6-5, but then we get a tied bass. Now this one, because it moves down, it doesn't come back up to the note, it gets a sharp 4. So it helps us modulate. Now we'll look at another rising by step, falling by thirds. Now, so this one we're going to look at the imitative counterpoint. When we start the 6th chord, we can jump down, because these sequences is related to the down by 5th, up by 4ths. They're closely related. So in this case, we can jump down to the 5th. So we can think of it like A, D, same sort of pattern. And then when we move up to the 5-3, that third can move down a third. So we get, when we put them together, now, here's another bit of the invertible counterpoint. When this pattern, this sort of is put in the top voice, we can pair it with tied bass. And we get this effect. But then then when we put that in the bass, we get rise by step, fall by thirds, with what would be a 6/5 chord. So, in conclusion, part of any trained schema. So what we looked at today with the regole were a number of different schema. There's many more than what I have here, but this is what we were able to cover for today. So they put them in different contexts, and we can see in the Fugetta, it moves through different keys. So we saw the tied bass in multiple different keys. So you're training it in different keys, different positions. We see different diminutions for different schemas. So we saw 2 different ones for example, falling by thirds, rising by step from the Giuliani. So they teach some of these schemas and how to properly accompany the bass. Now, with the Partimenti tradition, it's only begun to be revived. Much of it was taught orally. We do have some writing, but a lot of it just exists in manuscript. So what they talked about in classrooms, we can only guess at. So much of it has to be reconstructed. Now, part of the problem is that on top of the oral, it's keyboard focused, which is fine if you're a keyboardist, but for guitars, for polyphonic instruments, we have to create our own method a bit. We can, of course, pull elements from the keyboard, but some things we have to change a little bit. So the 19th century guitars, it offers a great blueprint for how to do this. They understood these rules very well, and by studying their examples, see how they problem solve and how they address. So when I play keyboard examples, often I'm like, I don't know what to do with this part. It gets weird here, they get compressed or whatever. I can look at the guitar repertoire and see, oh, that's how they did it. They just avoided that situation by either moving it up an octave, or, oh, they always stuck with 7ths and 6ths often for these situations instead of the 3rds. So there's so many different things, but the hope with the talk is that you can look, if you're a guitarist, you can look at the repertoire and learn to spot some of these schemas. So you can study on your own, oh, that's how I can recognize a rise by third, fall by step pattern. That's how they did it here. And when you're playing music, spot them quicker and to help you study when you study Partimenti on your own. So for me, Sort and Giuliani are excellent models. There's others such as Guada, Francois de Fossa, too many to name. But for this lecture, I think Sort and Giuliani are a great place to start because their little studies just perfectly encapsulate so many of these compositional principles. So that's everything. Thank you guys for coming, and thank you for listening. I can take any questions now, too.